It's August. I was going to start off for those of you who are regulars on our Zooms. Sometimes I like to start off with a joke. I was looking for ice cream jokes, but I realized I think in the last month or so we've pretty much heard all of the ice cream jokes. And along with all the ice cream jokes, I think we've heard a tremendous number of opinions and takes from this supposed leader or another, and conjecture and conspiracy theories. And we've heard a lot of people tell us about the decision that Ben and Jerry's made, what they did, what they really meant, why they did it, and what was in their heart of hearts. And I will tell you this, having certainly read many of those pieces and heard many of those opinions myself, I think the vast majority of the people who were sharing those were really sharing their own views. And they were not the people who made this decision. They were not the people who were part of this. They're not the people who built the company that lives its values and that made these decisions. And so I'm really grateful and really happy to have with us today the people who can actually tell you what they did, can actually tell you why they did it, what it means for them, and what this has been about. So again, thank you all for joining. I am super excited to introduce our guests. I'm going to start off with Ben Cohen. Ben, as you all know, is the better half of Ben and Jerry. He is a businessman, an activist, a philanthropist, and of course, the co-founder of Ben and Jerry's. With Ben, I am really just thrilled to have here Anuradha Mittal. Anuradha is the chair of the board of Ben and Jerry's. In her day job, she is the founder and the executive director of the Oakland Institute. She's an internationally renowned expert on human rights, on development, on agriculture. She has a long list of awards that she's won, but I'm just going to highlight my favorite because she was named the most valuable thinker by The Nation, which I think is a very cool award to win. To be with us in conversation today with Ben and with Anuradha, we've invited two guests, two friends, and I am thrilled to introduce Peter Beinart. Peter, as I'm sure you probably know, is professor of journalism and political science at City University of New York. He's editor-at-large of Jewish Currents. You've seen him on CNN. You've read his stuff in the New York Times. He is a non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. And of course, he now writes the Beinart Notebook newsletter on Substack. And I think we are going to share a link to that in the chat. So those of you who want to follow Peter's writings, you can do so there. And then lastly, but most certainly not least, is Suhad Babaa, who is the producer, publisher, human rights activist, and executive director and president of Just Vision, a really amazing organization that fills that gap on the media gap on Israel-Palestine through independent storytelling and strategic audience engagement, which I love. She is producing their upcoming film, Boycott, co-publishes the award-winning Hebrew language site, Local Call, executive produced the feature-length documentary, Nayla and the Uprising in 2017, and is an amazing partner and friend, and I am glad to have all of you here with us. Before I turn it over, I just want to go back to the housekeeping for a moment and say, as usual, if you'd like to submit questions for our guests, you can do so through the Q&A function. We are recording this. We will share the recording. We will turn it into a podcast as well. But with that, I will again say thank you. Thank you to all of you who have joined us. Thank you to our guests. And I want to start it off by turning it over to Ben Cohen and saying, Ben, share with us some opening thoughts on Ben and Jerry's, on this amazing company that you helped gift the world.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Hadar. Well, amazingly enough, Jerry and I were able to create a company that actually has a set of values and a mission, and I don't know, should I say a soul? It's a very interesting thing. Jerry and I first started as a little homemade ice cream shop, and we were just trying to sell ice cream, and then as the business grew, it became clear to us that business is really the most powerful force in our society. That originally the most powerful force in our societies was religion. And then it came to be nation states. And today it's business. And we believe that business needs to use its voice, its most powerful tool, to stand up for justice. That business is a part of our society, and it needs to contribute to society and not just take from the society. And so we tried to create a company that does have a set of social values, and we're incredibly happy to see that the company continues to act on those social values, due in large part to the great work of the Ben & Jerry's board of directors, which is headed by Anuradha. It's not easy to have a company that has some very clear and deep social values in living in a status quo of companies that essentially the only value that they have is to maximize profits. So it's been a really interesting journey, and I'm really glad that the company has taken on this very difficult issue of how Israel and Palestine hopefully will coexist. So yeah, we're using our voice, we're using our power to take a stand on that situation, which is essentially a stand in favor of human rights, basic human rights. And so we did it. We're proud of it, and happy to talk about it.
Great. Thank you, Ben. Anuradha, share with us.
Thank you, Hadar, and thank you, Ben. Well, just to be clear, because there have been so many rumors and lies and myths that have been spread, what is that decision? Ben & Jerry's decision is not against Israel. It is not about boycotting Israel, but the decision is that the sale of our ice cream in the occupied Palestinian territory is inconsistent with our values. And that decision was made after many years of work and engagement on these issues. So let me share a little bit about how we got to this decision. Members of the management and the board, they took multiple trips to the region. We spent time in Israel. We spent time in West Bank. Some of the board members even traveled to places like Jenin and Kilkilia and Hebron and other places. We met and engaged with a wide range of stakeholders on all sides of the issues. We met with government officials, folks from Ministry of Economic Affairs. We met with IDF soldiers who shared why they, the horrors they've experienced of facing bomb attacks. We also met with IDF soldiers who, after their service, feel that occupation is not beneficial for peace and reconciliation, either for the Israelis or the Palestinians. We met with Palestinian families whose homes have been demolished. We met with UN officials who are responsible for humanitarian affairs for the Palestinians. We met with farmers whose livelihoods have been devastated because of occupation. We saw the impact of this occupation and its disastrous impact for both Israelis and the Palestinians. So for a number of years, we engaged thought leaders, thinkers and activists working on all political, across the political spectrum on the issue of Israel, Palestine, occupation. And this is how we came to the conclusion that continuing to do business in the occupied Palestinian territory, where there's an occupation which is deemed illegal, by the United Nations and the international community is inconsistent with our values. Never ever was there discussion on boycotting or divesting from the state of Israel. It was focused on the occupied Palestinian territory. It is also very important to note that this was a decision that both the board and the management were aligned on. So there is no disagreement on that decision. And it is a Ben & Jerry's decision supported by the board of directors and by the management. We realized that our products were moving on roads where Palestinians cannot drive. Palestinian movement is severely restricted. A separate system of roads exists that are close to the Palestinians or that bypass Palestinian communities, and they've been set up for the settlers. According to OCHA, in 2018, there were over 700 permanent road obstacles to control Palestinian movement within the West Bank. We saw the devastating impact of that on livelihoods of the communities. We saw children stopped at the checkpoint from being able to go home after their school. We also learned of that there are nearly 150 settlements and 128 outposts in the West Bank, which according to the UN Security Council are flagrant violations under the international law. And in 2019 and 2020, as construction of settlements has accelerated, even though they're illegal under international law. So it is all of these things that we spent time on for years. That's how the company came to the decision. There are many who are attacking the company for this decision, but what is interesting is that they're spreading lies and myths, and they don't want to talk about the impact of this occupation. They are not in a position to defend this occupation, so they're spreading the lies about the company and that we were trying to boycott the whole state of Israel. Let me also end by saying that this was a decision that was made with the full knowledge of the impact it would have on our business and on this world. We made this decision with full knowledge that we will face opposition to the decision, but we will not be forced or pressured into doing business in a way that is counter to our values. As Ben pointed out, this is not just suddenly we have made this decision. In a rich, over 40-year history, Ben & Jerry's has taken positions which might not be convenient, but they come from a place of conviction and integrity, which is in the DNA of the business, which we are grateful to Jerry and Ben for giving to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Anuradha. I want to turn to Suhad now.
Thank you so much, Hadar and Anuradha and Ben. It's wonderful to be in conversations today with you and with Peter. I want to pick up, Anuradha, where you left off and actually zoom out. Ben spoke a little bit to this as well. The structure of Ben & Jerry's is quite unique, and the function of the board is also quite unique for corporations. Can you share a little bit more about what is the board at Ben & Jerry's, the independent board at Ben & Jerry's, and what is its decision-making guided by in terms of principles and values?
Thank you for that question. Well, as Ben pointed out, that this business has been built on three-part mission, which is our brand integrity, social mission, and the economic mission, which is now called the triple bottom line. But this has been the gift of Ben & Jerry's to the business community in terms of having an impact, a good impact, of being a social justice company in this world. At the time of acquisition, when the company was acquired by our parent company, now Unilever, thanks to the founders and the directors, and of course, our colleagues on the Unilever side, they came up with a very unique acquisition agreement, which calls for an independent board of directors. And the board of directors are vested with the responsibility for social mission and brand integrity. So our purpose is to ensure that we enhance and not just preserve the social mission and the brand integrity, and to continue the purpose with which this business was created. We're not just about making the best ice cream in the world, but to also use our voice to create a better world.
And one of the things that has been coming your way in terms of arguments is the idea that this decision regarding Ben & Jerry's to stop selling its product in illegal Israeli settlements or the occupied Palestinian territories is a double standard. Can you share a little bit more about other decisions, if any, that you've made that follow a kind of framework or rubric around how you think about the decisions along social justice or values-based social enterprise business making?
Well, Suhad, as I said, the decision that we took around Palestine was a very long, thoughtful process, speaking to different stakeholders. This is what the company does, the management and the board working together. We look at different stakeholders, we look at different opinions to be able to find a place in terms of our own values. Anytime we talk about going to a new community, a new country, a new market, we are looking at what difference can we make given a three-part mission? Is there ability to actually have an impact? We look at who would be our social impact partners, who would be our civil society partners that we can work with. In this country, some people have said, well, why would you be selling ice cream in the United States given human rights violations that we have? But working together with partners, we know that we can have an impact when we look at, say, criminal justice reform, or the call for ending qualified immunity, or the role that we can play around challenging voter suppression, voter rights suppression. So it is this way that we figure out where we can have an impact. And the company is always making decisions about how we expand our business. Is it, expanding within the United States or in new countries? And there are decisions being made. For instance, we took a decision to no longer be in Japan and that was a market decision. Our product was not doing as well. So we are always making those decisions. These are not rash decisions, and they're based on conversations with different stakeholders, looking at a three-part mission, the management leading the way, working together with the board. And this is how this decision was made as well.
Ben, I wanted to ask you, there have been those who have called this decision anti-Semitic, and yet I noticed that in the op-ed, the column in the New York Times that you wrote with Jerry Greenfield, the second line, I think, of that was the two of you describing yourself as proud Jews. So I wanted to ask you, what it felt like for you, for the company that you founded, to be called anti-Semitic, and why you think this is in fact consistent with Jewish values as you understand them.
It felt a little ironic to be called anti-Semitic. I'm certainly aware of a mentality and a group of people who believe that that if you criticize Israel, you're anti-Semitic. I don't agree with that. I believe the patriotic thing to do when your country is doing something wrong is to criticize it. I've certainly criticized the United States for many of its actions, and yet I'm still, a proud United States citizen. So Israel most assuredly has a right to exist. I support the state of Israel in general, but I'm against some of its actions. And one of its actions is oppressing a whole group of people in the occupied territories. So, impoverishing a whole group of people and causing unemployment rates that are above 40% is just inhumane and is a human rights violation. As we've mentioned before, it goes against the United Nations resolutions. So, I certainly understood when we took this stance that people were going to be opposed to it, but I think it's inaccurate. I think it's disingenuous to say that anybody who criticizes something that Israel does is anti-Semitic.
Thanks.
Suhad?
And I want to go ahead and kind of talk a little bit about the response to the decision that Ben and Jerry's has made. Anuradha and Ben, if you can share with us, the decision came out a couple of weeks ago, you made the announcement. And since then, there's been an onslaught of reactions, certainly from the Israeli government, from US lawmakers, from kind of right-wing voices in the political spectrum. You've also gotten some support and folks who've been reaching out with gratitude for the principal decision that you've made. Can you walk us through what those responses have looked like to date, just for the audience who's listening in today to catch them all up?
So Suhad, there's a whole range of responses. First of all, I want to acknowledge on behalf of the company, though I'm here not representing the company, thank you. Thank you for sending in your support and for understanding and giving us a right to be able to operate from a place which is in accordance with our values. In terms of opposition, it has been many different responses. Of course, there are individuals who have resorted to a lot of hate, vile messages, including death threats to individuals in the board, management. There have been threats, of course, to the company of boycott, that we will not eat your product. As you mentioned, there have been responses from the government of Israel to put pressure, asking the different US states which have BDS laws to put pressure on the parent company in terms of investments and pension fund investments in the stocks. So there have been all kinds of different responses. Before going further, I would just actually say, I respect those who have a different point of view. And in the same way as the company took action which is rooted in its beliefs and values, I respect the right of those who disagree to do the same. This is really about a fundamental American value, which is about a right to protest. What the company has done is not a boycott of Israel, though these lies have been spread. The board and management, I know I've said it a few times, and I might say it a few more times during the webinar, there was never a discussion on a complete pullout of Israel or a divestment from Israel or a boycott of Israel. What we all aligned around was that it's not okay for a product to be sold in the occupied Palestinian territory. And again, a decision that was reached after years of very thoughtful, considerate work as to what is the right thing for us in terms of our values. So what is really at stake right now when the threats come in is, on one hand, it's pretty shocking to see American democracy being under threat if it can have this much influence from foreign governments. But even more important, when I look at Ben and I remember, what was it? Like 2 years ago, you and Jerry getting arrested with activists to protect the environment, for a democracy in the US, a fundamental right to protest is something which is enshrined in the US Constitution. So it's almost like saying, if we are wrong in deciding that a product should not be sold in the OPT, it is saying that the international law is wrong. If it is saying that the US government and our right to protest is wrong, then it is saying that the US Constitution is wrong.
So Anuradha, I want to actually go back to this, because one of the things that I find, and that we found to be a point of clarification is that the anti-boycott laws, which have now passed in several dozen states in the United States, punish companies and in some cases individuals who are engaging in boycotts of Israel, which is defined as withdrawing or boycotting or divesting from both Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. Can you extrapolate a little bit more about what this means for Ben and Jerry's and this piece about the right to protest?
Well, again, as I said, in terms of our business, the company, we never even discussed boycott or divesting from Israel. We were focused on our product not being sold in the occupied Palestinian territory for the reasons that I gave before. And so the use and the threat of using BDS laws against Ben and Jerry's is pretty ridiculous, because we never talked about boycotting Israel. The board and the management have been aligned around that decision. I know there have been a lot on social media spreading lies about me as the chair of the board promoting BDS or pushing the company to do that. That has never been on the table. So what is really fundamental here is for Ben & Jerry's to be able to exercise its right to protest, for us to be able to protest against a policy which is wrong, which is the Occupied Palestinian Territory. And that is guaranteed by the US Constitution. It's a First Amendment right.
I want to jump in for just 1 second and note something. Anuradha, you said something that I thought was really important about, the influence of foreign governments. And I know a lot of times when people say something like that, then other people are saying, wait, she's inferring this or maybe that. So I just want to share a little bit, something that we've been paying attention to over the last few weeks that I think probably not everyone has seen up, firsthand. That's not a theoretical, that's not, a phrase to imply that, there's something nefarious at work. Very specifically, the Israeli ambassador has been in Washington on Capitol Hill talking to members of Congress. I have spoken with many of them who have shared their interactions directly, urging them to take action on this, urging them to speak to their governors, urging them to push federal legislation. So I want to be really clear that that wasn't some sort of like conspiracy theory that there are, shady things happening out there. It's really specifically the government of Israel is doing this, and they're not doing it privately. They're not being shy about it. The Embassy of Israel also urged the Association of Jewish State Legislators to convene a meeting with a an Israeli government official, an embassy official, to specifically talk about this, in which they, again, urge them to, in their formal official capacity, write to Ben & Jerry's and Unilever, urge them to write to their governors and to have those governments implement these anti-boycott laws. So I want everyone to understand that that's not some, that's not saying that there are dark forces out there or whatever else people like to put words into people's mouth. This is a really specific thing that the government of Israel is quite publicly, intentionally doing. So just wanted to add in that little detail. And with that, I'm going to turn back, I think, to Peter now, right?
Yes. Ben, I wanted to go to you, but Anuradha, you may want to join in on this as well. I imagine that over the years, many business leaders have come to you for advice, in how to run a successful company, maybe even how to run an ethical and successful company. I wonder, what, and Ben & Jerry's is not the first company to consider doing this. Airbnb also dipped its toe in these waters. I wonder what advice, what lesson you would have for other business leaders for considering taking this decision to not sell in Jewish-only settlements in a territory where Jews have basic rights and Palestinians don't.
I think it's about using the power of your company to stand up for justice, what's right. Ben & Jerry's developed a social mission and has taken stands on many, many issues, from the environment to refugee rights in Europe, to the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, to marriage equality, and we understand that it doesn't help to take a stand on an issue if everybody already agrees with you. We understand that when we take a stand on an issue, there's going to be people on the other side, but we consistently use our voice to stand up for justice. And the amazing thing that we discovered over the years is that the more we do that, the more ice cream we sell. I believe that there is a spiritual aspect to business, just as there is to the lives of individuals. As you help others, you're helped in return. As your business supports the community supports your business. And so, I think it's I think it doesn't work unless you're sincere. I think as long as your business is sincere in terms of the values that it has decided to stand up for, the values that it believes in, our experience is that customers love it, is that customers are normally buying from companies, from corporations, despite what the corporation stands for. Because usually all the corporation stands for is maximizing profits and their own narrow self-interest. And my experience is that customers are delighted when they come across a company that's using its power not in its own narrow self-interest, but in the interest of the community as a whole. And that's what Ben & Jerry's has tried to do. And we understand, people disagree, that's fine. But our experience is that if you want to build the strongest bond possible with your consumers, building a bond based on shared values is pretty much the thing that you can, the thing that allows you to have that really, really strong bond.
Anuradha, do you want to jump in on this, or what advice you would give to a company that was considering this decision?
Well, I don't know if I have much to add to what Ben said, but I think I will say I think it's a moral imperative today for a business to be relevant, to not just be focused on profit taking. If it is a part of community, it has to act like one. And that requires, again, rather than this myopic short-term profit and loss view, instead of that, look at the long-term strategy of how to be sustainable. And that requires communities to be sustainable. That requires this earth to be sustainable.
Thanks for that.
I think, if you'll excuse me, there's this issue of terrorism. And, so the United States started a whole war on terror, which is an absurdity. It's not possible to have a war on a tactic. And yes, there have been terrorists that have attacked Israel, and Israel has every right to be concerned about that. But the solution to terrorism is not impoverishing entire villages and bombing entire villages and bombing entire countries. The solution to terrorism is based on human rights. And we need to, there are terrorists, and terrorists are criminals. Criminals need to be tracked down and prosecuted. That's finding individual terrorists and tracking down and prosecuting them. It's not penalizing and impoverishing entire countries and communities.
So thank you, Ben and Anuradha. We've got now, I know a lot of folks have put questions in through the Q&A. So thank you again. If you do have questions, use the Q&A function, not the hand raise, not the chat. The Q&A is where we are monitoring and collecting. So we've got a bunch of them, and I'm going to turn to Suhad to ask the next one.
Fantastic. So some folks are getting into what this all means for Palestinian communities in the West Bank and the occupied Palestinian territories. If you can speak a little bit about whether Ben & Jerry's will be sold to Palestinian communities in the occupied Palestinian territories, and if you're looking for a Palestinian distributor to do that. And I think the bigger picture question there is, regarding the decision to not renew the contract, what are the implications of that? If you can kind of spell that out a little bit further about who will be impacted by that decision.
Well, as of now, we have to still figure out what we were clear on, that a product cannot be sold in the occupied Palestinian territory. And as I said before, that there's been alignment, and we have never discussed withdrawal from Israel as a country as a whole, or being in the Palestinian territories. Those are the details that are to be worked out. And unfortunately, I'm not in a place to speak about them because I have no knowledge of those. Those are things that the management works on and brings to the board.
I wanted to ask a question about the response to this. Maybe I'll start with you, Anuradha, but happy, Ben, for you to join in if you'd like as well. I imagine when you were thinking about this decision, you thought about what the response might be like. I wonder what response you anticipated, how the actual response was similar or different from what you expected, and just a little bit about what it's been like.
Well, we are not novices. We were not surprised by the kind of response we would have. The process and the way the information has been spread hasn't been perfect. As I said before, there have been lots of rumors and myths and deliberate lies and accusations. So all of that has been to be expected. This is not the first time. We have seen the situation has gotten so bad over the years that to be able to talk about human rights, raises, instead of talking about the human rights violations, you go into conversations about being a Jew hater, anti-Semitic, all of those things personally that have been called, with big photos, and newspapers, and lies about interpretation of your writing or what you stand for. But again, none of that is surprising. If it were that popular position to be taken, we would not be dealing with the kind of human rights violations that I was referring to. If people were already understanding what is at stake in terms of human rights, we would not have the kind of situation that exists in the West Bank right now. So we expected that. What is disheartening is to see people's ability to respect another person's right to disagree politely. The indecency, the misogynistic and racist and intimidation, including death threats, that is not for any civilized society. That is not the basis of any conversation around democracy. You cannot even have a conversation. You and I can disagree. We might have different perspectives, and I'll respect, as I said, for another business, do not follow Ben and Jerry's. I will respect, a shop do not carry Ben and Jerry's. They have a right to do that. But to turn that into lies and to call names and false allegations and threats that people are forced to move from their homes, that is not okay. That does not reflect very well for any country or any religion or any individual.
Anuradha, thank you. I want to jump in here and actually kind of flip the conversation. And we're getting a lot of questions here about how best to support Ben and Jerry's. If for folks who agree with a values-based decision to not sell products in the occupied Palestinian territories to align with your company, with your values, how are you looking for support right now?
I think people need to speak up and speak up publicly. I think that it's much more effective for people that are not Ben and Jerry's to be defending Ben and Jerry's than it is for Ben and Jerry's to be defending itself. It's much better much more powerful for third parties, individuals to find ways to be public in their support.
And if I may add, yes, like we used our voice, please use your voice. And not just to support Ben and Jerry's, but please support the parent company, Unilever. The fact is the board and the management came to this decision together that a product cannot be in the occupied Palestinian territory. As the parent company has said, that's not its position. And it respected the acquisition agreement, which calls for the independence of Ben and Jerry's. So use your voice to support the parent company Unilever, and please support Ben and Jerry's.
I want to just add something on that from an organizational perspective. You know, I think the same day, maybe the next day after the announcement, certainly we came out in support of the decision that you made, and tried to add our voice to clarify that what you were doing is, frankly, exactly what we call for. It's opposing the occupation, it's opposing the settlement enterprise, and differentiating that from the state of Israel, right? And saying these things are not the same. And I mean, it's really been a moment where I think, frankly, a lot of people have told on themselves, right? People in the American Jewish community, people in the Israeli Knesset. We saw, many of you, I'm sure, saw it, 90 Knesset members signed a letter that was very critical of the decision. That was the bad news. The good news is that actually after we and I'm sure others reached out to a number of them, we said, what are you talking about? They're doing exactly what your parties, the Labor Party, the Meretz Party, stand for in opposing the occupation. Why would you object to that? And they sort of sheepishly removed their names from that. But what it shows is that I think all of us, organizations, companies, individuals, need to really be proactive on this. We need to keep doing it. Putting out a statement once was not enough. Saying a thing once is not enough, because we've seen the overwhelming avalanche that's coming from folks who are opposing this. So again, I will just add our thank you again, and that we're going to continue to keep supporting this and continue to keep speaking out, including to those members of Congress and members of the the Jewish State Legislators Association and others. So
I would just add, if I could, I mean, there's also been over the years some very prominent Israeli Jews who have said that they would not perform, for instance. So the writers David Grossman, Amos Oz, and Aleph Bet Yehoshua, perhaps maybe Israel's three most famous writers, all saying that they would not perform, along with a whole series of other artists in the settlement of Ariel. So it seems to me, if Ben and Jerry's is anti-Semitic for doing this, then so are Israel's most leading novelists. But I wanted to ask a question, Anuradha, to go back to something you said earlier. I think just in my own personal experience, I have seen again and again how people, regardless of their political views, including people from the Jewish community who are quite, far to the right in their political views, have been impacted by seeing on the ground what life is like for Palestinians without basic rights in the West Bank, what it means to live and not be a citizen of the country in which you live, without due process, without free movement, under a different law than your neighbor, simply because you're of a different religion and ethnicity. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit in a little more detail about some of the things that you have seen while traveling to the West Bank.
Well, Peter, in my own personal capacity, I have traveled to Israel and West Bank several times. And it's a very beautiful part of the world. But also with the beauty is a lot of tragedy. I wouldn't know where to start, but if you talk about, starting with the settlements, as the settlements are increasing, the demolitions are happening, where you find Palestinian families not able to build on their own land. So they're forced into building without permits and then having to pay for those demolitions. And with those demolitions come a lot of traumatic stress. Like I met this family in Jerusalem whose home had been built and destroyed like 6-7 times. The children waking up in the night to know that the bulldozers have come to bring their home down. And now it is like a shrine to show what demolitions do. Or sitting in Jenin, looking at the wall which had divided the field of the farmers who cannot access most of the land because it is on the other side of the wall. And so their livelihoods are gone. Or looking at the trees between 2000 and 2019, nearly 1 million productive trees of the Palestinians have been destroyed by the occupation. But the worst was in Hebron and Nabi Saleh, where I met a young woman who wanted to be a journalist, but the occupation meant that she had to be a lawyer to be able to defend her people. Met young people and the parents who's, parent of this child who had already been in military jail at the age of 10. And he said that it is not us who take away the childhood of our children, but it's the occupation which is taking away childhood of our children. Or visiting Ada refugee camp. These are refugees since 1948. When we look at nearly 8 million Palestinians who are refugees out of the 12 million, they're displaced. And the numbers go starting from 1948 to 67 war. So those refugees and the ones who continue to stay in refugee camps near Bethlehem in the Ada refugee camp. And in Hebron, to see the checkpoints. The restricted access that the Palestinian families cannot walk on the street which the front door opens to. The fact you have to take a roundabout way to be able to get to your home, to see the commerce, the most important street for the markets and the commerce shut down. That is in Hebron, and people living with tarps above them because the settlers who are above are throwing feces and garbage on them. And to see the inhumanity of it, to see how communities have been dehumanized. Now that is not sustainable, and that is not good for peace and stability in the region. It is not good for Israel. It is not good for Palestine. I can say, as I believe in the state of Israel's right to exist, but we have to work towards ensuring that everyone can exist. And that only happens when human rights of all are respected. That is the basis for peace and security. That is the base for human dignity. And that is the basis for democracy in the region, which a democratic country like Israel actually should be doing to maintain peace and security and stability in the region.
Anuradha, I really appreciate your reflections on how important it is to be thinking about the rights of whom and making sure that all human beings are treated with equality and in a rights respecting reality. I wanted to take a minute because we've been talking a bit about Israel-Palestine. I want to come back to this piece that Ben talked about in his op-ed. Ben, you talked about the fact that this decision about Israel-Palestine is not unique. You mentioned the peace pops many decades ago. You talked about Ben and Jerry's desire and opposition to the Persian Gulf War. I know I've long been following Ben and Jerry's, both as an avid consumer of many, many pints of ice cream, but also in the really incredible positions you've taken at critical moments. Last year being just one of them, as there were uprisings and protests across the United States calling for racial justice. Can you speak a little bit about what those decisions have looked like in other examples? Other values-based decisions that you've made that could help us understand how Israel-Palestine falls into context?
Well, I think, you mentioned the peace pops. That was a product that we came out with before the end of the Cold War. And essentially what the company was saying was that our country, the United States, ought to be dealing with the root causes of the Cold War instead of just trying to deal with the symptoms by building up more and more military and purchasing more and more weapons. Essentially what we were saying was, wouldn't it make sense for the people of the United States and the people of the Soviet Union to get together and spend some time together to build bridges of friendship instead of walls of fear? And we were suggesting that we take 1% of the US Defense Department budget and use it for those peace through understanding activities. And it's kind of the idea that war does not create peace. War creates more war. And that's what, and our opposition to the Persian Gulf War was, based on that same idea that you can't bomb a country into peace. And it's the same thing with Palestine, that you can't impoverish that country into peace. It's counterproductive. You just end up creating more and more terrorists. You end up creating more and more enemies. So what? it's it's kind of not popular. It's governments like to make wars. Governments have huge military budgets. They have huge militaries. 50% of the US discretionary budget is spent on the Pentagon. So the 50% of the US discretionary budget is not spent on peace through understanding activities. It's not spent on meeting people's basic human needs. I mean, it was George Bush who said that poverty is the breeding grounds of terrorism. And if you want to create a more stable society, a more stable world, what you need to attack is poverty. You don't need to be bombing villages into non-existence and impoverishing people. So yeah, it's been a very consistent stand that the company has taken. I mean, we've taken a stand in favor of shifting money out of nuclear weapons in the United States into education. Yeah, it just flows from that deep history.
Thank you, Ben. I got one last question I want to sneak in before we wrap up, which is a little different. I was actually talking to some of our colleagues from Peace Now, from Shalom Achshav in Israel this morning, and they were very excited to hear we were doing this, and of course, are also supported of the company's decision. But one of the questions that they actually asked was, as part of this, have you thought about trying to impact Israeli public opinion, right? And and is there any thoughts on the part of you as individuals or as a company to think about speaking to that population? Because I think a lot of people here sit and look at Israel and say, oh, well, the government is very right wing. In the same way you could have certainly in the last administration looked at America and said, well, look at that government. Of course, there are a lot of people with broad political opinions, including those that absolutely are supporting Ben and Jerry's decision around this in Israel. So I pose their question to you, whether as individuals or as a more on the company level, there's thoughts about really trying to impact the public opinion in Israel.
I never thought about that.
Yeah, that's very useful feedback. Hadar, I will mention, I think in the course of reaching this decision over the years, we did speak to many individuals, organizations within Israel as well, including Israeli human rights organizations and many different actors. But that's a very useful feedback.
Great. Well, I'll just close that little piece by saying, if you decide you want to do that at some point, we've got lots of partners and friends and allies on the ground who want to be part of that conversation. So maybe just since Anuradha, you were going, I'll turn back to Ben for a minute. I don't know if you've got any closing thoughts you want to share in a minute or so, and then Anuradha, I'll come bring it back to you.
Closing thoughts. The situation in the Middle East has been, really difficult to deal with. I certainly understand the need for a Jewish homeland, and I support Israel. I disagree with Israel's stand on the situation. And I understand that at the end of World War II, these countries got together and said, yes, the Jews should have a homeland. Yes, I agree with that. I was under the impression at the time that there were not people living in that area, but apparently there were. And they didn't like the idea of a Jewish homeland being established where they were living. And I can certainly understand that. But what I absolutely believe to the core of my being is that mothers in Palestine have no desire to kill the children of other mothers in Israel, and that mothers in Israel have absolutely no desire to kill the children of other mothers in Palestine. And I do not believe that the majority of people anywhere want to kill other human beings. I think it's governments that get in the way, and I believe strongly, also to the core of my being, that peace will never come to Israelis and Palestine and Palestinians if we don't find a way to create a situation where Palestinians can have a decent life. And right now, they cannot have a decent life because of Israel's actions. And so I believe that Israel's actions need to change in order for Israel itself to benefit.
Thank you, Ben. Anuradha.
Well, first of all, thank you to everyone who's been on this webinar and of course the panelists. If I may speak just as Anuradha, not as the chair of the board of Ben & Jerry's, I'm going to request that please allow and respect the right of Ben & Jerry's to be able to make a decision to do its business in a way which is consistent with its values. These are basic rights that we should be able to give to each other, even if we disrespect. Those of you who feel that this is anti-Israel, that this is anti-Semitic, it is anti-this, it is not anti-anything. In fact, it is occupation which is anti-Israel. So this decision is really pro-humanity, pro-human rights, pro-Israel and pro-Palestine because it starts building peace, and it's occupation which is wrong. So I think for all of us who care about humanity, who want a decent world, first of all, we need to learn to disagree with each other, in a respectful fashion. And secondly, recognize our basic freedoms, our basic human rights, whether they're enshrined in the Constitution of the United States or in international law. And with that, when we can do that, there can be hope for peace. We have to lend our voices as citizens because, as Ben pointed out, governments and warmongers, those hawks that profiteer from war, that has to end. Those budgets can be used for peace building. Those budgets can be used for education. Those budgets can be used for healthcare. And it's about time that we demand a better, safe world for our children, not just in Israel and Palestine, but for all of us around the world. This madness has to end. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Anuradha and Ben, thank you both for being here with us today. Thank you for what you have done and are doing, what you have built and are building. Suhad and Peter, thank you both for being here with us and adding your voices and your thoughts to this. And thank you to the many hundreds of folks who joined us for this today. Again, as Ori shared in the chat, this link will be shared. You can find it on our social media. You'll find it on our website. And if you go back and look in the chat, you can find it directly where you can find the podcast. So I thank you all. I look forward to being with you all someday in person. Thank you, and so long.
All right.